Hello, hi everyone. So lovely to see people online. And we're going to kick off right on 12 because it's got quite a lot to cover today. So I'm going to kick us off. We are recording this. Feel free to say good day in the chat. Before I continue, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are on today. I'm currently on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, in North Melbourne, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. Feel free to pop in the chat where you're calling from and acknowledge your land as well if you'd like. So, hi, I am Jen Riley. I'm the Chief Impact Officer at SmartyGrants. I have been here for almost 12 months, but I've spent my whole career in the social sector, so 20 plus years. I've specialised in outcome measurement and monitoring and evaluation across a range of projects, and both as a program manager, evaluator and consultant. I did run a grants program at United Way Australia, so I have experience as being a grant maker as well. I'm currently a board director at Windana Drug and Alcohol, and I have 2 little people in my life, so pretty busy. So today, what we will cover, really these 3 things. I think there's a lot we could talk about. It could take us days to go through content, but I think the key things that we will cover today that I really hope you walk away with is the ability to explain what an outcome is and what an outcomes mindset is, and differentiate between objectives, outputs and outcomes. These words are often complicated and mixed up with each other. So I just really hope you get some clarity today in what those terms mean. And also to understand the relationship between a theory of change to outcomes and activities. I'm not going to teach theory of change or attempt to in 20 minutes. I'm just going to sort of walk you through it and show you the relationship so that if you want to find out more, you can go ahead and do so. If you have any questions during the chat, put it in the chat. Michael is sitting to my left and he's moderating, and we will attempt to answer them at the end if we can't already answer them whilst we're going, or I cover it later on in the training. We will do our best to cover them, and if anything goes unanswered, we will have a go at sending through in the follow-up email some answers to those questions if I know what the answers are. So we do have some audience participation as well, so please pop those responses into the chat. So my first one is, why should funders measure outcomes? Like, why bother? Have a go, pop it in the chat. Why should you, as a funder, measure the outcomes of your investment? What are some of the reasons you think you should do it? Don't all talk at once. We're watching the chat here. Accountability, lovely. Thank you, Lucy. That is a very, very important one. The evaluation. To know that you are achieving what you intended to do. Brilliant. This is starting, now we're going really, really, really fast. Hey, Vic. It's good to see Vic on the line. Used to work with Victoria. Consistency, yes. Value for money, absolutely important, especially when you're custodians of, investment funds, such as many of you are, or taxpayers' money. That's really, really important. Learning, one of my key drivers for evaluating is learning about what's working well and what we can do to improve. Bronwyn, thank you. Determine whether the funding was appropriate. Absolutely, that is something that we talk about. We don't talk about enough, appropriateness. Yeah, and reporting back, that accountability back to the funders, the donors, the taxpayers, and so on. The effectiveness. So lots of very good reasons why we need to do it. And I think that business case is pretty clear. I've just popped up a couple here on the screen, but I think we've probably covered more in the chat. Being accountable for what we say and do, which is so important. As I said, stewards or custodians of, most of us are custodians of other people's money, and you have boards or trustees you need to report back to. assess if anything is changing for people, the environment or other intended beneficiaries, learn about what's working well and what we could do better. And I've put in a cheeky comment here about everyone else is doing it, but I do think there is increasingly a movement towards outcomes. There has been for the last sort of 10 years or so, and increasingly more and more people are doing it. There is an expectation of it. So I think, I think building the capacity of your grantees to do outcomes measurement will really help them go for other money and help them talk about their impact. So I think there's a lovely consequence of that as well. So let's jump straight into it. What are outcomes? They are benefits or changes for the individuals or organisations participating in a project, program or initiative. They're the changes in what people can do, think, know or can do, or what their condition is. So for instance, behaviour, whether or not they exercise, their attitude, for instance, their attitude towards recycling, their circumstances or conditions, so whether or not they're employed or whether or not they're diabetes type 2. Knowledge, do they have the knowledge to access their rights? Skills, do they have the financial skills to, look after a budget? That little acronym BACS is quite a useful one to hang on to for you when you are looking at outcomes either that you're writing or that somebody has submitted to you. Just going quickly through that list and going, is it one of these? Because if it's not, the chances are it's not an outcome. This is not by all means the list. There may be others. There's things like motivation and awareness. There are other things that fit inside the outcomes definition, but this is just a short list. It's a neat acronym. Whenever I've used it, people have just loved it because it's just something they can get hold of and remember. The other thing that's nice to do is to understand something by what it's not. And so I've put up this table about outcomes versus outputs, and especially as these two get mixed up all the time. So if nothing else, I hope you walk out of this session with a very clear understanding of what an output is versus an outcome. The orientation of an output is that is the thing that your grantees will produce. They will deliver or produce outputs, with the intention that that will create a benefit to the end user. So it's the number of services or deliverables, for instance, the number of events they put on. The outcomes are the benefits or the improvements that are experienced by the end user. So it could be economic development or cultural enrichment for the community. So an output is a program, a training, a workshop. It's something they're doing. The outcome is what the benefit is for the. So if I was standing in a room, you'd see me sort of walking from left to right, demonstrating it's an orientation, something someone does, and then something someone experiences. The experience, the knowledge, the skills, the change of condition is the outcome for the user or the beneficiary or the client, whatever language you use. The question is, for the grantee, what did we do? And you should be saying, what did you do? Versus what difference did you contribute to, which is the outcome. So outputs are generally quantifiable, often binary. They either did or they didn't, and you can count them. Outcomes can be quantifiable, but they can also be qualitative. So we can have that data back in terms of interviews or focus groups. Now, outputs enable outcomes. This isn't a downer on outputs. We need outputs because without outputs, we don't have outcomes. And that's my point there, that outcomes require outputs. So we need both. And there's a great article there in the HBR.org. I've put that down there where this article came from. So, and I've just sort of adapted it slightly. But that's a really great list. And I think hanging on to that, sticking that, on your desk or wherever will also help when you're making that assessment about have they actually given me any outcomes, or is it just a list of outputs? Now, this is a classic one and one that evaluators debate a lot. So I'm curious to hear what you think. What do you think about participation? given that sort of definition I've given you around it being an orientation, what's participation? Is it an output or an outcome? I'm not trying to catch you out here. It's just a nice way to sort of engage people in the conversation. Already had some feedback that not all outcomes are benefits. There can be unintended and negative outcomes, that's for sure. Alison's going with participation being an output. If we agree that an output is something that is produced by the organisation and the outcome is something that the beneficiary does, Jackie said it can be both. And Vicky has said intermediate outcome as a stretch. Exactly. It is a very low order outcome, but it is someone, a user or a client making a choice to participate, to turn up, is actually an outcome. And it was actually Michael Quinn Patton, who's the sort of, godfather of evaluations, talking at a conference once where he put this up and said, if it's something they're doing, they are turning up, you're putting the workshop on, but they're participating. So the outcome, it's a low order, and it's not where you want to stop measuring. You certainly want to know, well, so what? When they participated, did they learn anything? But in terms of it's a behaviour, they turned up. It's an outcome. So the outcome mindset, it requires us to start with the intended beneficiary. What are their challenges, their needs, their issues, their constraints, their priorities. And this should be what your grantees are doing. They should be thinking that next step along. It's challenging for a funder because you ask one step removed. You have this intermediary in the middle. You have this you are the granting organisation, and then you have a sort of a delivery organisation that you're funding. They need to be really thinking, and you want to know how they came up with those outcomes. Are they talking to these beneficiaries? How do they know what their challenges are, their issues, their priorities? How do we know that those outcomes are important to them? So this might mean that the outputs are wrong. And that's a really challenging conversation to say to people is, well, you're running this workshop, but how do you know that that's the way you're going to get those outcomes for those beneficiaries? Is that the best use? And that comment about appropriateness came up earlier. How do we know that was the most appropriate way, the appropriate use of dollars? For instance, making an app for a phone, is that the best way, or is there another way to do this? I've got a cheeky example next, just to drive the point home. What is the output in this example, and what is the outcome? Who wants to have a crack at that? The output's the ad. That's exactly, yes, it is an output, but there's something in the ad that's an output. There's something that's created, outcome happiness, allegedly. An output is the Coke. That's exactly it. Many of us would say there are other outcomes such as sugar addiction, diabetes, dental decay. But marketers are excellent. They won't sell you the output. They won't sell me a car seat for my child. They will sell safe child. And as a parent, they get me every time. This is going to make, a happy, healthy child. They don't sell me the plastic bag or I'm thinking about those milk bags that they used to sell to us for a fortune. They don't sell us the product. They sell us the outcome. They're very good at it. So what is an outcome mindset then for a grant maker? And I think, I've sort of said this before. It's asking these questions. How is our investment in the community contributing to change for our intended beneficiaries? And you would have some opinions on who the intended beneficiaries are. And I think you've got to be sort of, in a way, be clear yourself on the outcomes you're hoping to achieve. Asking the questions about exactly what is that change and for who are you hoping that your dollars will contribute to? Because essentially you are commissioning outputs to be delivered by organisations. So you want to know what the intention is of commissioning those outputs. So it takes this reorientation, and this is where I'm going to come to. I've spoken about outputs versus outcomes, but I want to talk about objectives for a moment, because many of you will have objectives in your strategy documents or funding guidelines. And so an objective is something you intend to do or achieve. Again, that orientation, that's something you, the organisation, intends to do. So it might be to increase access to sports or arts, community events or healthy lifestyles. So the question then is, if we take one of those, we want to increase access to community events, which is a classic in local councils, that's their objective. And we say, why? To what end? And this is the conversation I had with one recently, because they told me that was an outcome. And I'm like, no, that's an objective. But tell me why, what benefits do you want the end user to have? And they then rattle off a whole paragraph. They go, well, so more people are connected to each other and spend money and generate income for local businesses and build a sense of community cohesion. And I'm like, whoa, okay, great. You've just listed, 3 outcomes in a sentence. So let's just slow that. Let's unpick those. And here I am highlighting the outcomes in that statement. People know why they do things. And I think it's that thing about prompting. When you have those conversations with your grantees and they're telling you about this awesome program they're delivering, you say, okay, well, tell me, why? How does that contribute to change, this wonderful literacy program you're running or this event in the park? Tell me what we're hoping will come out of that. And they'll list it for you. They'll tell you. And then we just literally take those things I've highlighted in red, put them in a list, and then put some words around them and turn them into outcome statements. It can be just that simple. And I did this activity recently with a local council in Melbourne, where we took those statements, those big paragraphs, those multi-barreled statements full of outputs and objectives, and we just unpicked those keywords and we came up with these outcome statements. And here I've gone another step just to unpack that statement a bit more. This is how I do it. There are many different ways of doing this, but generally people talk about outcomes and have a word with a direction in it. They might say it's an increase or a decrease, but there are also words such as enhanced or commenced. It's about a change at the end of the day. Something that's changing for someone. And then in the middle is that sort of the what is changing. So that, go back to the backs. Here, this is a behaviour, so it's daily exercise. And then it's the who, who's having that change. Look, by no means perfect, and people that are probably a bit further along in their outcomes journey may do this slightly differently. But if this is a 101, so it's a bit of a refresher, and there are some people on the call who are starting out. If you wrote an outcome statement like that, you can be pretty confident that that will pass. And especially if you can make sure that that middle word, that middle couple of words, is a behaviour, an attitude, a condition, a knowledge or a skill, that you're on track to it being an outcome. So when do they occur? This is the next piece, because they're not all created equal. I think it was Vic that called out before, the expression immediate at a stretch. There are different levels of outcomes, and so they appear over time. And I've put here short term, medium term, and long term. Which isn't coming up on the screen. There it is. And what is short term, medium term, and long term can be very different for projects. And each project can set its own time horizon, because what some projects see as long term might be a generation. For somebody else, it might be 2 years. So I think that's determined by your program and your context. But here again is just an example of what could be a short term, medium term, and long term for what we're doing here. I would hope that as a result of today, an immediate outcome would be improved knowledge about outcomes measurement. In the medium term, I would hope in the next few weeks you adopt outcomes into your grant process. So we're starting to see a shift from sort of learning awareness and skills through to behaviour and practice. And then in the long term, you'll start measuring outcomes and learning what is working and not working for your granting programs. And then we might see some shifts around your behaviour in terms of changing your grant program, having impact on your policies and so on. And then maybe, in 10 years' time, it could be increased economic activity in the community, perhaps. Depends what your organisation's long-term goals are. Of course, there's a lot that can happen over one meeting today versus in 10 years' time. And as the gap between the activity and the time of the outcome, the less that outcome can be attributed to that activity or be said to be the outcome was the activity contributed to the outcome. So another way of looking at this is the short term. This example here is a healthy living program in an aged care setting, is that instead of going left to right, we're going top to bottom. And again, the more we move away from the activity, the less control you have over that outcome, as I said before, the less you can claim it, that your one training session resulted in world peace, for instance. It's about sort of understanding the way that outcomes work. But what we hope is that you have a line of sight. What we're hoping is that by doing the activity, you can talk about a plausibility that all things holding true, you'll improve knowledge with the intention that those knowledge of benefits will result in a change of behaviour, which will result in a change in conditions. We've talked about blood pressure in this example, and then right up to that population level, where I've definitely drawn a line saying, it's very, very hard to claim population outcomes for projects. Often that's a collective impact type setup. I hope there are some questions coming through as we're going through. If there's anything that you've got a question about, please pop it in the chat. So just again on population and program level outcomes, and this language comes out of results-based accountability, but I do think it is useful to make that distinction between population level outcomes, which none of your grantees can be held accountable for, and program level outcomes, so improving the mental health of the whole of City of Greater Dandenong. But what they could say is they're improving the mental health for the program cohort, that could be their aim at least. So let's have a look at some examples. These have been given to me as outcome statements. What's wrong with these two statements? Anyone want to have a crack at the first one? Where would you start giving feedback on that one, given what we've talked about? Very quiet on the chat. People might be thinking. Any issues with that, or even that second one? Yeah, exactly. We don't know who the participant is. Create a benefit how? Yeah, that's right. Here we go. Too vague. Absolutely, Matthew. And that's one of the biggest challenges, is that people write outcome statements and they're just too vague. So it's like, well, going back to the who's benefiting, what sort of benefit? Is it a behaviour? Is it an attitude? Is it a condition? Is it improving? Is it decreasing? So having a degree of specificity in there does help, because when we come to measure outcomes, which is a whole separate discussion, you need to have what we call the evaluand clear. So who has outcomes? Many people at many different levels of the system. We talk about individuals, families, schools, neighbourhoods, right out to wider communities and population groups. Mostly we talk about individuals, but you can have outcomes for groups as well. I'm just going to go through some language, and this is the language that, we use here at SmartyGrants, and, I've seen versions of this, certainly in many of the organisations I've worked as well, that this idea that there are primary beneficiaries, so those that are intended to be better off as the result of the program, so for instance, children. Secondary beneficiaries, so those are the ones that are not directly targeted but may benefit. And so the example we give here is that, a country sports program may impact the wider community and contribute to a sense of community cohesion. But the primary beneficiary could be the person participating in the sports program, or people employed by the program. But there is a secondary benefit there. There is the next ring out. And then there's intermediaries, and this is an important group, and actually a lot of people in social change actually do work through intermediaries. And I'll give you some examples. So these are the people or groups that you work through to achieve your program goals. They may also be better off as a result of the intervention. So here's a good example here. Early literacy program for under 5s. One of the early outcomes in this program was increasing daily reading with children. Now, in the outcome was actually the parental changing, or the guardian changing their behaviour, like them reading daily. So the child is the primary beneficiary because ultimately improved early literacy skills as a result of being read to. There are other examples. I've worked on other programs, especially sort of in health, where we've worked through GPs and changed and educated GPs' attitudes towards certain health issues has resulted in increased outcomes for certain population groups, such as women from overseas or young LGBTQI. But working through the GP has resulted in better outcomes. It's a good theory of change to reach service providers. Other ones are working with businesses to improve their attitudes and approaches to employing young people. So a number of examples where your grantee may actually not be working with the end point. You may exist to improve outcomes for children, but they actually might be working through intermediaries. And that's, as I said, a really valid, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that can make quite a difference working that way. So how do we come up with outcomes? And ideally it should be part of a wider strategic planning and program design process. It's answering this question about, well, what change do we want to create, and turning them into outcome statements. Many people can reorientate objectives to outcome statements, much like the example I walked you through earlier of asking those questions, having someone give you a paragraph sort of response, unpicking them, writing them up. But one that's used a lot is that the sort of the theory of change method, where you start with current state, what's the problem statement or the opportunity, and then where do we want to be? So what's that sort of, what are we aiming? What's our North Star? So as I said, my favourite, an extra E in there, though, is to do a theory of change. And this is a theory or a hypothesis of how we will contribute to the change. So you can certainly do one as a granting organisation, is work out how you believe change will take place to perhaps improve youth employment. You could work out and document how you think change takes place based on the evidence. What are the levers? What are the things that contribute to that? Be it school completion or, relationship with a mentor, or active to, opportunities to go into internships and so on. You can document that and then publish that, and then say to grantees, where do you fit in this theory of change? Which aspect of this do you contribute to? And you can even leave some of those boxes open and say there may be other things that we don't know, but tell us where you fit. So it is worth having a theory of change for a grant maker. So let me just take you through some 101, what is a theory of change? This is just an example that's been taken from Funnell and Rogers, wrote an excellent book called Program Theory. The example is, you know, we've got children have poor health. We want improved health for children. So we're going to give out free apples. And, you know, I think some people might remember the milk programs of the sort of 50s and 60s. You know, this idea that you give something and then, you know, we'll improve the outcomes. But the challenge with this is that when we go to evaluate this program, we find out that we distributed 100 apples to 100 children, but health only improved in 50 children. We have no way of understanding what happened. You know, what went wrong? Was it a design fail or an implementation fail? And this is where logic models or theories of change, and I'm using those two words interchangeably here. There is a difference, but I'm not going to go into it today. But for the purposes of this type of causal diagram, logic models help us to understand the relationship between our activity and our intended outcomes. They provide information about what is here, the black box. And sometimes this also gets referred to as a miracle leap. You know, we'll run a program and then we'll have unicorns. You know, it's like, well, what happens in step 2? You know, what is the intention that will happen? So it's worth pulling this out and explaining this. And this is what theories of change do. So I'm going to encourage you, we've got a bit of time, but I'm hoping you've got a bit of paper in front of you. And on that bit of paper, maybe you can turn your pad sideways, so you're looking at a landscape perhaps. And I've got someone sat next to me who's doing this. And draw yourself 4 boxes. And if you had Post-it notes nearby, you could pick up 4 Post-it notes. But, you know, I doubt there's people walking around with Post-it notes. But if you ever have the chance, do it with Post-it notes, because you can move them around and you can, you know, recycle them. So you've got your 4 boxes on a page. The first box has provide free apples, not free children, free apples to children. And in the last box, you've got improved health for children. So pop that in those boxes. And I want you to have a go of filling out the 2 boxes in the middle. And look, there could be 3, there could be 4, but let's have a crack at just putting something in the 2 boxes in between. And you could have more branches that go up and around and feedback loops. It could be a lot more complicated, but let's just write a simple, plausible theory of change, how we think providing apples is going to result in improved health for children. Give you another sort of minute to have a crack at that. What comes next? Giving these kids apples, we're hoping they're not running around playing cricket with them, using target practice on each other. We're assuming the kids are at school to start with. A lot of assumptions that go into theories of change. All right. The biggest one, I hope, is that the children eat the apple. That would help. And then after the children eat the apple, I've just written here that will improve levels of vitamin C. And then, you know, if there's improved levels of vitamin C, there's improved health for children. Because there is a link between, you know, apples and bit C and health. So there's a bunch of assumptions, as I said, in there. The first assumption is that they don't throw away the apple, that they like apples, that they're not missing their front teeth like my kid is at the moment. You know, that the fruit is fresh and has high levels of vitamin C, that hasn't been in storage for 3 months. You know, also we're assuming that the levels of vitamin C were low to start with. So there's a bunch of issues with it. But I think once you're able to create the theory of change, then you can start pulling them apart and documenting your assumptions and improving them. They're often best to do with other people. It's nice to have a chat with someone. We've always done them, the organisations I've worked for, we've always done them with groups of people. We've never sort of sat in a room and done them ourselves. They're always something that's done collaboratively. So in terms of the outcomes, I hope you can see that on the screen, that what we've done is you can see that providing free apples is the activity. The apples are the input, but providing the apples is what the organisation does. The outcomes, so what's happening for the end user or the beneficiary, is that we hope they've increased their consumption of apples. We hope that they've improved their levels of vitamin C. And we hope that they've improved their health. And we can go ahead and do some measures around those things. So the number of apple cores left over could be an example. You could do a random sample of bit C. And then, we could look at sort of percentage of children that have experienced a health issue in the last 6 months. I mean, there's definitely other ways to improve children's health, and, a theory of change would probably be a lot more complicated, but this is a starter. And I think being able to at least be able to sit down and have the skills of putting post-it notes down or writing on a piece of paper and identifying what the outcomes are, and then you can translate those outcomes into a list. And that's the list that many people can put on their granting applications and say, these are the sorts of outcomes we would hope to see from our grantee programs. And you may say, look, it's a 1-year program, so we're not expecting you to improve health, but we're expecting you to at least increase consumption of fruit and veg, or increase behavior, physical activity. You can put down what you expect the outcomes to be, and then say to your grantees, you're the experts on the ground, you work out how. Do you have to create a bunch of slinkies to get them to eat the apples? What do you need to do? Do you need to play bobbing apple games? They get to have the fun to work out the how, but you setting the outcomes is a useful way to sort of get your granting program on track. Okay, so we've covered a lot in sort of 40 minutes, and I've left some time for a chat as well and some questions and answers. What we've tried to cover through today is explaining what outcomes are and what an outcomes mindset is, differentiating between objectives, outputs, and outcomes, and understanding the relationship of a theory of change or a program logic to outcomes and activities. So it's meant to be a sort of a refresher or a very introductory webinar. I'm sort of taking you over quite a bit in the last sort of 40 or so minutes. Let's have a look at some of the questions that are getting at some thanks. People might need to head off and have some. Oh, great. Matthew's actually put his results in there. That's useful. Class pauses for fruit break. I love that. And being focused on school. There's some really great outcomes. Okay, I've got some questions. This is from Rabbi Yosef Wolf, has asked, given outcomes are long-term and difficult to measure quantitatively, what are ways to measure the degree to which they're attained, particularly within the reporting timeframe? It's such a good question, Rabbi, because you're often funding organisations for a certain time period, and you would hope the benefits would extend beyond that report, that period of time. You can either give them some funding to ask them to actually report on those outcomes, so to go out, 6 months after the end of the project, collect some data and report back. But you would have to fund them for it. You'd have to sort of make a provision to say, the program finishes, but we would like you to submit a final report. Maybe you hold back maybe 10% of the funding or something. We'd like you 6 months later to go and do a follow-up, or 12 months later. You could certainly put it in your contract arrangements. there's some administration to follow up. People don't like to keep too many grants open, but you can do it. And if it's important to you, and to be honest, I think it would be really, really good for the grantee to, for them to see what happens 6 months or 12 months later, because often they don't know because they can't afford to do it. They'd love to know. They might hear it anecdotally, around the traps, because often many work and live in community. So that's definitely an option, is to make an allowance for it, put it in your contract, set that expectation as part of your granting application. But the other part of that question was, I think long-term outcomes aren't that difficult to measure. I think you can measure that long-term change, so improvement in health. I think attributing them back to the project is what is difficult, because it could be that I've had a great health outcome, but that wasn't because of that training session. It's because I joined the gym, and that's contributed to a great health outcome. But you might come and have a conversation with me and I'll say, but you know what, that session really got me thinking. And then I went and joined the gym. And then, you've got a story to tell about, contributing to change. So there are ways to, most things can be measured. It is possible to measure most things. So I think, most things can be measured quantitatively. But the question there, though, that you've gone on to ask is about the degree to which they're attained. And this is the issue around contribution analysis. So if in 3 years' time a change took place, so a young person, became a local leader, and 3 years earlier you funded them to go off to Sweden on a mentor program or whatever, what we do is we go and talk to that person years later and we ask them the question, how do you think this event how did this event contribute or not contribute? Tell me a story, and to what degree did it contribute? And John Maines in the US, as a Canadian evaluator, did a fantastic piece of work called contribution analysis. And he talks a lot about helping people measure in a 1 to 7. He uses a 1 to 7 scale about the strength of contribution of an activity to an outcome. And people can give you that data. And the other thing is looking at the counterfactuals. And so you sort of say, well, what else happened? So we saw an uplift in school readiness in a community that I was working in North St Mary's in New South Wales. Now we wanted to claim that and say, well, that was our program. But in actual fact, there was government policy change where all childcare workers had to have a certain level of education. So that was a system change that it happened at the same time. So you've got to sort of look around and say, well, what else has happened in the context of the community, the context of that person? And in a way, it's like putting an argument up in a court of law. You kind of have to get the evidence to say our program did contribute somewhat or significantly to this outcome. So that takes time and energy. And I think as a grant maker, I think one of the things I do advocate quite strongly for is that you provide a monitoring evaluation budget for your grantees. And most organisations I've worked for in the international aid sector make an allowance of 10% of all their projects. And increasingly we're starting to see that with domestic programming as well, that if you want them to go out and do this analysis, collect data, present evidence for their claims, they're going to need some funding to do that. And I think that 10% gives you that sense of proportionality. If it's a $100,000 grant, spending $10,000 working out if it worked or not is a proportionate amount of money. You don't want them spending all the money on evaluating. You actually want them to deliver. But, I think it's good to sort of have a sense that they do need some funding to go out and do this analysis. Any other sort of questions that have come through? Any other sort of comments that people would like to make? I've got a bit more time. Normally I get lots and lots of questions, so I leave quite a bit of space, but looks like there's quite a conversation going on there today. Okay. Thank you. This is an opportunity if there's any confusion around terms or you'd like some clarity on. Thanks, Simone. If there's any other sort of comments or feedback you'd like to sort of, or anything you'd like to know more about. As I said, I didn't want to smush measurement of outcomes into this session because it's a bit too much to do in an hour. But if that's something that you'd like covered, I think it's something we're going to look at doing. Okay. Oh, now they all come. I've opened the floodgates. That's great. Okay. So Bronwyn, any suggestions on how to encourage grantees to include outcomes that may be negative or a byproduct of the funding they didn't anticipate? Such a great question, Bronwyn, because I think it's about trust, right? You know, what we know is that there is such a strong power dynamic between grantors and grantees. And I think where I've seen this work well is where there's a relationship, and I think the evidence base would support this, where there's a good relationship between the grantor and the grantee, that if there is trust, a dialogue, and that it's about improvement and learning, and you can have those conversations about what's not working so well, or this went belly up. I mean, it's a bit like your relationship with your boss, right? Like if you've got a good relationship, you can go to your boss and went, oh, I really, really stuffed this up, you know, but often, you know, it's not about them stuffing things up. It's actually just about going, we tried this and this didn't work. And it's not anyone's fault. It's just, you know, social change is complex, it's messy, there's things going on in community, you know, there's pandemics, there's bushfires, there's floods. They need to be able to come to you and say, look, something's going down in community. We were trying to do an online thing. It's just not working for some reason that, you know, young people aren't engaging this way. Can we pivot and try something else? And I think being able to be flexible and say, tell us what's working so we can work with you to adapt, to support you to adapt and change. Because at the end of the day, you want good outcomes. You want to give them the space to be able to adapt and evolve. And that's by sharing learnings, what's working. I think it's about, you know, there's certainly, we've got places in our forms, you know, at SmartyGrants, for people to put in unintended outcomes, but no one's going to be putting that in the boxes unless they trust that they're not going to somehow, you know, be penalised. And might think, oh, if we say that, we're not going to get funding again. You know, we might be blacklisted. So I think you've got to create a culture and create an enabling environment where people can share what didn't work. And we've seen some great things. There was a whole report put out by Engineers Without Borders years ago called, you know, the failure report. And so how confident were they, you know, to put out that report talking about what didn't work? And I think because at that stage there was a real openness from, you know, government departments, especially in international aid, to talk about failures, to talk about learnings. So if you create that, and if you hero those in a way and say, well, you know, here's an organization that's told us what's not working. Isn't this great? We can all learn from this. And it's a positive thing. And you create that sort of positive dialogue amongst your grantees. You might bring them together for learning circles. I've seen grant makers do that. You know, at the 6-month mark, bring everyone together. Let's talk about what's working, what isn't working. But as I said, you'd have to set up that space for real trust and safety for people to have to talk about that. But such a great question. What else have we got here? So, Matthew, would you agree that it's the responsibility of the grant maker to outline the assumptions that we made with our apples? That is the responsibility of the grantee applicants to outline the creative and practical how. You know, I can't talk to every single context because, you know, I think, you know, there's so many different types of grant makers out there and grantees, but I do think we're in it together. And I think, you know, more and more grant makers it's less about writing blank checks anymore. I think you're all highly invested, highly informed about the issues you work on. You may have come from the program, you know, on the ground programming yourself. So you'll have a particular view and knowledge and experience that you'll want to put into a theory of change. And I think you can do that. I think you can outline those assumptions. I think when you get a grant that's been applied for, they do need to, I think absolutely, they do need to outline the how and how the how fits in with those outcomes and that theory of change. And if it doesn't fit, why not? And how does it contribute? So I think I think we've all got responsibilities in that. Yeah, that I think you do get to outline some of those assumptions. The grantee does get to sort of either agree or disagree, or definitely the how. I mean, it may be that there's a strong evidence base. Take vaccines. We know vaccines work. Government funds the vaccine. They didn't leave it with the local health clinic to say, you come up with a way to solve COVID. There's a time and a place for grants to be quite prescriptive. And then there's a time and a place, I think, for you in your portfolio to say, let's do something creative and innovative here. It depends on the strength of evidence. It depends on the complexity of the problem as well. Is it a simple problem that can be solved with a simple solution? You know, such as we know vaccines work, or taking Panadol resolves a headache, or is it a more complex problem requiring a more complex intervention that may change over time, such as raising children? I've just used the Dave Snowden examples of simple, complex, complicated examples there. Any other questions? This is such a great question, Jackie. The impact reporting. Can grant givers really report / claim to have achieved this? Are you asking the question about, you know, just because we put out $500,000, do we get to claim everything that happens as our benefit? Is that what you're meaning in that question? I can't turn you on for a chat. Yes. Such a great question. Years ago, I did United Way did an impact report, and it was the sort of the impact of our funding across, you know, a portfolio of programs. So we had youth program, children's program, mental health program, and we funded a bunch of people, and we put together this report saying this is sort of the outcomes. And I remember being asked from the floor, can you really claim that? You know, like you didn't do it, your grantees have done it. I think we're going to be careful with the language and the framing. I think it's about contribution. I think it's about saying, look, you know, we've invested this money, we've had these conversations, we're working with partners and grantees, and the grantees are, you know, have done collected some evidence that demonstrates that these outcomes took place. It's a long boat. Look, it is. It's sort of, you know, it's a few, you know, stepping stones over the pond. But it's such an essential role to play. I think being able to sort of tell your story and tell your contribution, tell your theory of change about how you've worked with partners or invested in certain areas to, you know, create social change. I think the impact report is about telling that story. I think it's about putting up some of that evidence and putting up some of those numbers, and then talking about, you know, what your role has been. And I think the more we talk about it, the better, right? Because we can learn from each other. I think you're going back to the why, you're being accountable to your board, your trustees, or the minister, or the taxpayers. Hopefully in that impact report, you have had a chance to learn about what's worked and what hasn't worked. You know, you have been able to do some assessment or report on an assessment or an evaluation of the benefits. Yeah, so I think the word claim is a challenging one. I'd be wary of claiming, you know, especially in longer term changes. It's all about the strength of evidence, really, and what you can report. How are we challenging? How else are we going? What's this? This one, Roman's another question here about any suggestions on how to encourage grantees to include outcomes. Oh yes, we've just talked through that one. Sorry, reading the chat. Okay, well, if there's not any more, you can have an early mark and go and have your lunch, or a late lunch. But if there's any other questions, fantastic. Thanks, Barbara. You're on your beginning of your journey. Good on you. I hope this helps. We will send out these slides. Use them. Blame me if anyone questions you. You know, I've been in this game for 20 years. You know, I've done probably up to 100 frameworks, I think. There's always going to be debate over the terms, because evaluation is a relatively early field. We're sort of 30 years old in some ways. there are going to be people who, but at the end of the day, it's about purpose, and it's about the people we work for and in the name of and alongside with. And I think let's keep focused on what we're here to achieve. So thank you so much for calling in. I hope it was useful. But yet, look, my next slide there. Thank you. We will send out some information. Oh, that's the SmartyGrants stuff, but this isn't, necessarily SmartyGrants related, but you can certainly, send through comments to me, look me up on LinkedIn or whatever. Thank you. Have a great afternoon. Cheers.